I am Paige, 33 years old, and the chief operating officer of a supply chain software company in Chicago. My father suspended me and demanded I apologize to my sister to save her fragile ego. I simply looked at him, smiled, and said, "All right." The next morning, my sister was smirking until she realized the entire company network was locked and the corporate lawyer was sprinting down the hallway completely pale. My father's arrogant smile died instantly when he realized he had just evicted the only person who actually owned his company. If you are watching this, let me know in the comments where you are from. And hit subscribe if you have ever had to teach your toxic family a lesson they will never forget. Let us go back to the boardroom where this all started. The glass doors were shut tight, and the tension inside was suffocating. My father Harrison slammed his heavy hands against the mahogany table. He demanded I pack my desk immediately. I was suspended for 2 weeks without pay, and I was not allowed to return until I wrote a formal apology to my younger sister Sydney and sent it to the entire executive board. I sat perfectly still. My hands rested lightly on my laptop. I watched the pathetic theatrical performance unfolding in front of me without blinking. At the other end of the table sat Sydney. She was 30 years old, dabbing her perfectly dry eyes with a tissue. She wore a pristine designer blouse and played the victim with absolute precision. Sydney held the title of Vice President of Sales. She earned that title entirely by sharing DNA with the CEO. Meanwhile, I had practically built the operations of this company from the ground up while my father played golf and took the credit. My mother Brenda chimed in right on cue. She did not even work at the company, but she had a habit of showing up to board meetings just to ensure the family image remained spotless. She claimed my behavior was completely unacceptable. She said Sydney worked exhaustively on the Vanguard account, and for my operations team to fail to update the back-end integration was pure sabotage. She actually accused me of embarrassing my sister on purpose to ruin her big moment. I looked at the Vanguard contract sitting dead in the center of the table. A $4 million deal. It was the biggest contract of the quarter, and it had just imploded spectacularly at 9 in the morning. Why? Because Sydney had promised the client a custom software integration that our system simply did not support. I had told her 3 weeks ago in writing that the integration was impossible without a 6-month development runway. She ignored my email. She promised the client it was ready, and then she blamed my department when the live demo crashed and burned in front of their entire executive team. I kept my voice eerily calm. I told them I did not sabotage anything. I stated clearly that I sent Sydney an email outlining the technical limitations, and she ignored it to push the sale through just to get her commission. My father turned a dangerous shade of red. He yelled that I was always hiding behind emails and technical jargon. He claimed my sister was out there shaking hands, bringing in revenue, and securing the future of the company while I could not even back her up. Then he brought up the real issue. He reminded me that Andre was executing his final due diligence this Friday. He asked if I had any idea how a $4 million lost contract looks to a venture capital firm. Andre was Sydney's husband. He was a brilliant, razor-sharp African-American executive at a top-tier Chicago venture capital firm. Andre was a man of absolute principle built on hard facts and data. He did not play family politics. His firm was preparing to inject $10 million into our company. It was a lifeline my father desperately needed because the business was quietly bleeding cash. Harrison was terrified of spooking Andre. Sydney was terrified of looking like an incompetent fraud in front of her high-powered husband. So the solution was to make me the scapegoat. I looked directly at Sydney and asked if that was the plan. She had the audacity to sniffle again. She whispered that she just wanted to make Dad proud that she tried to innovate, and my team just did not support her vision. My mother leaned in close, lowering her voice so the junior executives outside the glass walls could not hear. She hissed at me to just write the apology. She told me to take the blame and not make a mess right before Andre's audit. She said family protects family, completely ignoring the fact that they were throwing me to the wolves to save Sydney. My father pointed a finger directly at my face. He repeated his terms. 2 weeks. I had to leave my keycard with security. I would be locked out of the servers. He ordered me to go home, think about my attitude, and apologize to Sydney for gross negligence. They expected me to fight. They expected me to pull up the server logs, to scream, to demand fairness. That was the old me. The person who spent 33 years trying to prove her worth to a father who only saw his golden child. But I looked at my father's red face. I looked at my mother's manipulative glare. I looked at the hidden smirk on Sydney's face. I simply said, "All right, My father blinked. He was clearly thrown off by my total lack of resistance. He asked me to repeat myself as if he could not believe I was surrendering so easily. I stood up and closed my laptop. I told him I would take the suspension and leave my keycard. I never said I would write the apology, but they were all too relieved by my compliance to notice that minor detail. As I walked out of the boardroom, I saw Sydney drop her tissue. Her fake tears instantly vanished, and she actually smiled at me. It was a mistake she would regret for the rest of her life. I did not storm out of the building. I walked calmly to my office, locked the door behind me, and opened my laptop one last time. My father truly believed he was locking me out of the company. He did not realize that I was the company. 5 years ago, when Apex Logistics was transitioning from a legacy software model to cloud-based solutions, we desperately needed a proprietary core architecture. Harrison Ever the cheapskate refused to allocate the $2 million budget required to buy a proper enterprise system. He told me to figure it out. He called me the tech wizard and demanded I build it on a shoestring budget. So I did exactly what he asked. But I did not build it under the Apex Logistics umbrella. I could not because Apex did not have the funds to cover the server hosting the external developer contracts or the licensing fees. I formed an anonymous limited liability company called Aegis Tech Solutions using my own personal savings and a massive bank loan. I built the architecture, held the copyright, and quietly licensed the software to my father's company for an aggressively low monthly fee. We utilized a simple month-to-month handshake agreement because Harrison always claimed he did not like complicated paperwork with his own daughter. What Harrison never bothered to review were the actual terms of service governing that handshake. The user agreement clearly stated that any suspension or termination of the primary administrative officer without cause immediately terminates the licensing agreement and completely revokes all access to Aegis Tech Solutions servers. I typed a few swift commands into my terminal. I did not delete anything. Deleting data would be a federal crime, and I am not a criminal. I did not sabotage their code or plant a virus. I simply clicked a button that formally revoked the license for Apex Logistics to use my intellectual property. The system was meticulously designed with a dead man switch. It would execute precisely at 8 in the morning the following day. I calmly packed up my favorite coffee mug, my ergonomic mouse, and a framed photograph of my golden retriever. I left my corporate keycard sitting squarely in the middle of my perfectly clean desk. The silence in my office was comforting. It was the sound of a completely severed cord. As I walked to my car in the parking garage, my phone vibrated in my pocket. It was a text message from Sydney. The message read, "Have fun on your little vacation, loser. Next time try doing your job instead of being jealous of me." I read the message, locked my screen, and did not reply. There was no point in arguing with someone who was about to lose everything. I drove back to my downtown apartment, poured myself a generous glass of Cabernet, and slept better than I had in a decade. The anxiety that had weighed on my chest for years simply vanished. The next morning, at exactly 7:59, I was sitting on my balcony, overlooking the Chicago skyline, sipping a mug of black coffee. The crisp morning air felt incredibly refreshing. I watched the digital clock on my phone screen slowly tick over to 8 o'clock. Across the city, at the Apex Logistics headquarters, 50 employees were logging into their terminals. The dispatchers for our Midwestern trucking clients were actively trying to route their massive delivery fleets. Trucks loaded with perishable goods were waiting for coordinates. The accounting department was in the middle of processing weekly payroll. Sydney was probably sitting at her desk sipping an overpriced latte, trying to figure out how to spend her unearned commission from the Vanguard deal she had just ruined. Every gear of my father's fragile empire was spinning. At exactly 8 in the morning, every single screen in the entire building went black. A split second later, a stark white, unclosable dialog box appeared on every monitor, tablet, and mobile device connected to the Apex network. The message was simple and absolute. Error 404. License revoked. Unauthorized use of proprietary intellectual property. Please contact Aegis Tech Solutions LLC for compliance. In an instant, the company ground to a catastrophic halt. Dispatchers could not see their delivery maps. Sales reps could not pull up client contracts. Sydney could not access her performance metrics or her lucrative prospect lists. The entire digital nervous system of Apex Logistics ceased to exist. I pictured David frantically flipping through his digital archives searching for a software licensing agreement that gave Apex Logistics ownership of the code. He would find nothing. He would realize with mounting horror that the CEO had built an entire logistics enterprise on rented land. I pictured Harrison shouting at the IT department demanding they bypass the screen, only to be told that the cloud infrastructure was entirely hosted on private servers they had zero administrative rights to access. And then there was Andre. Andre's venture capital firm required flawless operational uptime. Their technical auditors were scheduled to comb through the system architecture the next day. An unexpected company-wide blackout 24 hours before a $10 million due diligence review was not just a red flag. It was a massive blaring siren that screamed operational incompetence. If Andre saw that error screen, he would pull the funding immediately. Sydney knew this. Harrison knew this. My phone started ringing at exactly 4 minutes past 8. The caller ID flashed David. He was the company's general counsel, a man who charged $600 an hour to solve Harrison's problems. I watched his name flash on the screen, took another leisurely sip of my coffee, and let it go straight to voicemail. It rang again. Then it rang a third time. By 8:15 in the morning, I had 12 missed calls from David, 7 from Harrison, and 4 from Sydney. My phone was lighting up like a slot machine. The voicemails began piling up. First came the confused questions from my father demanding to know if the server was experiencing a glitch. Then came the slightly panicked messages from David asking for the admin override passwords. Finally came the frantic, high-pitched messages from Sydney demanding I fix whatever I had broken before Andre found out. I set my phone face down on the glass patio table. The pressure cooker had officially detonated. They had demanded I take the blame to preserve their flawless facade for a venture capital audit. They had assumed I would simply bow my head and absorb the punishment as I always had. But they had fundamentally misunderstood the power dynamic in that boardroom. I did not just manage the operations. I owned the very foundation they stood on. And I was comfortably sitting miles away, completely untouchable, waiting for the real panic to set in. I sat back and watched my phone screen light up continuously. 12 missed calls from David, 7 from my father, 4 from Sydney. I felt zero guilt. I picked up the phone and silenced the ringer. Notification badges piled up silently, building a digital monument to their absolute terror. I swiped away from the call log and opened my social media applications. I wanted to see exactly how they had spent their evening after practically throwing me out of the company. I already knew my family's predictable patterns. Whenever they committed an act of supreme injustice, they immediately threw a party to validate their own terrible choices. Sure enough, Sydney's profile was updated with a fresh sequence of stories from last night. The first video showed the interior of an upscale steakhouse downtown. The lighting was dim and golden, illuminating a sprawling table covered in expensive seafood towers and empty martini glasses. My father sat at the head of the table, his face flushed with wine and unearned triumph. He was holding up a glass of scotch, toasting directly to the camera. Sydney panned the lens around the table, giggling loudly. Her caption read, "Celebrating a massive departmental restructuring, out with the old toxic energy, in with the new era of success." I stared at that caption for a long time. Out with the old toxic energy. She meant me. She had just cost the company a $4 million contract through sheer incompetence and ego. She forced me to take the fall for her catastrophic mistake. And then she went out to eat caviar and drink vintage champagne, celebrating my suspension as if she had just won a corporate victory. Her second video was even more revealing. It showed my mother Brenda smiling brightly and clapping her hands. Brenda leaned into the frame and said something about how proud she was of Sydney for taking charge and leading the sales team to new heights. The absolute delusion was staggering. They had successfully convinced themselves that removing me was a strategic triumph. But the most interesting part of the video was the man sitting quietly next to Sydney. Andre. He looked sharp in his tailored suit, smiling politely for the camera, but his eyes looked slightly disconnected from the manic celebration happening around him. He raised his glass when prompted, completely unaware of the reality of the situation. I knew exactly what my family had told him. They certainly lied to Andre about the Vanguard contract. They probably told him the deal was delayed due to minor technical updates, not entirely lost, because his wife made impossible promises. They undoubtedly lied about my absence. Knowing my mother, she probably spun a story about me taking a much-needed mental health leave due to burnout. They needed to keep Andre totally in the dark. His venture capital firm was scheduled to deposit $10 million into the company accounts tomorrow. Andre was a brilliant financial mind, but he trusted his wife. He trusted his father-in-law. He believed he was investing his firm's capital into a stable, growing enterprise. He had no idea he was sitting at a table with people who were actively burning the company to the ground. I felt a brief flash of sympathy for Andre. He was strict and uncompromising in business, but he was fiercely loyal to his family. He genuinely believed Sydney was a hard-working executive. He had no clue she was a liability, who relied entirely on my operational infrastructure to mask her daily failures. I tapped on the next video in Sydney's story. It was a selfie of her holding a designer handbag. The caption over the handbag read, "An early reward for closing the quarter strong." Thanks, Dad. My father had bought her a $10,000 bag to celebrate my suspension. He rewarded her for losing a massive account and forcing me out. Their financial recklessness was breathtaking. They were spending money they did not have to celebrate a victory they did not earn. I closed the application and set my phone back down on the glass table. The contrast between their arrogant celebration last night and their blind panic this morning was poetic. Last night they were toasting to my absence. This morning they were staring at black screens, realizing that my absence meant the immediate death of their entire operational capability. They thought I was an employee they could discipline. They forgot I was the architect who held the keys to the kingdom. My coffee was getting cold. I took one final sip and looked out over the city. Morning traffic crawled along the streets below. Everything looked perfectly normal from up here, but I knew the exact level of chaos currently unfolding inside the corporate office. The phone finally stopped lighting up with missed calls. The sudden digital silence was absolutely not a sign of surrender. It was a sign of escalation. They had realized that calling me was useless. The problem could not be solved over the phone. The dialog box on their screens explicitly stated that they were locked out due to unauthorized use of proprietary intellectual property. David, the general counsel, would have explained what that meant by now. He would have told my father this was a legal barricade, not a technical glitch. I knew what was coming next. My father was not the type of man to accept defeat gracefully. He was exactly the type of man to demand compliance through sheer intimidation. The silence meant they were no longer trying to reach me digitally. They were coming physically. I stood from my balcony chair, picked up my empty mug, and walked inside my apartment. I calmly walked to the kitchen sink and began rinsing it. As the warm water ran over my hands, the intercom on my wall buzzed with an aggressive, continuous tone. The concierge was announcing my visitors. The inevitable confrontation had officially arrived right at my front door. I pressed the button on the wall intercom. The voice of my building concierge sounded strained and deeply uncomfortable. He informed me that my parents were standing in the lobby causing a massive scene and demanding to be led up to my floor. I told the concierge to send them up immediately. I did not want them screaming at the front desk staff. I unlocked my front door, left it open an inch, and walked back to my kitchen. I leaned against the cool marble island, took a deep breath, and waited. 10 seconds later, the heavy wooden door flew open and slammed violently against the wall. Harrison barged inside. He looked like a man on the verge of a massive cardiac event. His expensive silk tie was yanked loose. His face was a terrifying shade of purple, and he was breathing heavily. My mother Brenda scurried in right behind him. She was clutching her designer handbag tightly to her chest like a protective shield, her eyes darting around my apartment, as if she was looking for a trap. Harrison did not even say hello. He pointed a shaking finger directly at my face and started screaming. He demanded that I sit down at my computer and turn his company back on right this second. He looked utterly unhinged as he described exactly what happened to his precious business at exactly 8 o'clock that morning. He said he was standing in the middle of the open sales floor, giving a motivational speech to the team, when every single monitor in the entire building went completely black. He described the absolute silence that fell over the room for 3 seconds before the stark white dialogue boxes appeared on every screen. He recited the exact words that I had coded into the system. Error 404. License revoked. Unauthorized use of proprietary intellectual property. Harrison screamed that the blackout was absolute. He said the logistics dispatchers were literally crying at their desks because they had over 50 long-haul trucks stranded at way stations across the Midwest with absolutely no routing coordinates. The accounting department was completely frozen in the middle of a massive payroll run. The client portal was dead, meaning our top-tier customers were staring at the exact same ominous error screen. He told me that Vanguard had already called his office 4 times, threatening to breach their remaining contracts and take their business elsewhere if the supply chain was not restored immediately. Brenda chimed in, her voice shrill and panicked. She said Sydney was currently locked in her executive office having a severe panic attack. Sydney could not access her prospect list, her email client, or her commission dashboard. The entire digital nervous system of Apex Logistics had ceased to exist, and they were bleeding thousands of dollars every single minute. I let them yell. I stood perfectly still, resting my hands on the kitchen counter, and let them describe the total operational paralysis I had engineered. I absorbed their panic and let the silence stretch out heavily after Harrison finally paused to catch his breath. I asked him a very simple question. I asked if he had called David, the corporate general counsel. Harrison yelled that David was the one who told them to drive to my apartment. He explained that when the screens went dark, he ordered the IT department to aggressively bypass the lockout. When IT failed, he called David to draft an emergency legal injunction against whatever hackers had taken over the servers. But David did a quick corporate registry search on the company named in the error message. David discovered that Aegis Tech Solutions was registered entirely in my name. My father demanded to know how I could do this to my own family. He called my actions corporate sabotage. He called it extortion and financial terrorism. I calmly corrected his frantic accusations. I explained that I did not sabotage anything at all. I reminded him of a conversation we had 5 years ago in his office. I reminded him that when the company desperately needed a modern software infrastructure, he flatly refused to fund it. He told me to figure it out on a shoestring budget. So I built it myself on my own time with my own personal money. I formed an LLC, secured the copyrights, and licensed the software back to Apex Logistics on a very generous month-to-month basis. I explained that our simple user agreement contained a very specific termination clause. By suspending me without cause and locking me out of the building to protect Sydney, he legally triggered that exact clause. The dead man's switch executed perfectly. He did not get hacked. He legally evicted himself from my property. Harrison slammed his fist on my kitchen counter. He threatened to sue me into oblivion. He swore he would have David draft a massive lawsuit for corporate damages before noon, drag me through court for the next decade, and take absolutely everything I owned. I smiled warmly at his threat. I told him he could absolutely file a lawsuit today. But I warned him to think very carefully about the legal process of discovery. I explained that if he sued me, my lawyers would immediately subpoena all of the company's internal communications and server logs. We would pull every email I ever sent to Sydney, warning her about the Vanguard deal. We would expose every metric proving her complete incompetence. If we went to open court, those documents would become public record. Andre and his venture capital firm would see the complete operational nightmare my father was desperately trying to hide before tomorrow's audit. Brenda gasped loudly and grabbed Harrison's arm. She realized the trap immediately. Harrison's aggressive posture suddenly crumbled. His anger rapidly curdled into sheer, desperate panic. He realized he had absolutely no leverage over me. He asked me what I wanted. He assumed this was a ruthless negotiation for my job back or a massive salary increase. I looked him dead in the eyes and told him I wanted nothing. I told him he suspended me, so I took my property and left. Then I decided it was time to escalate the conflict to a level they could never recover from. I told them that when the system locked out, it triggered an automated security protocol on my private servers, and that deep scan audit revealed something much worse than a lost Vanguard contract. I told my father I found the fake vendor invoices. The color drained from my father's face. His angry red flush was replaced by a sickly ash gray. He stumbled backward half a step, his expensive leather shoes squeaking against the hardwood floor. My mother looked between us with wide, confused eyes. She clearly did not understand what a fake vendor invoice meant, but she could read the terror radiating from her husband. She gripped the marble island to steady herself. I kept my voice level and explained exactly what I found. I told him my automated security scan reviewed the financial integration, bridging our sales software to the corporate banking portal. That integration was controlled exclusively by Sydney. I found a recurring diversion of corporate funds silently draining the company for 14 months. The money was funneled into 3 separate shell companies registered in Delaware under the guise of external marketing consultancies. I told him the number, $1.5 million. That was the total amount Sydney had embezzled. But the worst part was the executive approval chain. 2 months ago, the accounting software automatically flagged those massive payments as fraudulent. My father, the chief executive officer, personally authorized a digital override to clear the flag. He knew his golden child was stealing $1.5 million, and instead of turning her in, he buried the evidence. My mother let out a sharp gasp. She dropped her designer handbag on the floor. She grabbed his arm and shook it frantically. She asked him if it was true. She begged him to look at her and tell her I was lying. She could not comprehend that her perfect daughter was a criminal. Harrison could not look at her. He stared blankly at the floor, completely defeated. They finally understood why they were so incredibly desperate for Andre's venture capital injection. They needed his money to secretly plug the massive financial hole Sydney had created before the Internal Revenue Service noticed. They were planning to use a highly regulated fund to cover up a federal felony, and I held the only map to their crime. Before anyone could speak, the heavy silence in my kitchen was shattered by a loud ring. It was my father's cell phone. He fumbled in his jacket pocket with shaking hands. The digital screen displayed David's name. The corporate general counsel was calling back with his emergency legal analysis. I told my father to answer it and put the call on speaker. He swiped the screen and placed the phone flat on the cool marble island between us. We stared at the device as if it were a ticking bomb. David did not bother saying hello. His voice blasted through the speaker in a state of absolute panic. He yelled that he had just pulled the complete corporate registry files for Aegis Tech Solutions and cross-referenced them with the initial software development timelines. David told Harrison directly that they were legally dead in the water. David explained the intellectual property revelation in brutal legal terms. He said there was no loophole they could possibly use to seize the software back. I owned the core code, the server infrastructure, and the copyrights entirely. David screamed that since Harrison had only signed a month-to-month user agreement, the company had zero equity in the system. The moment Harrison formally suspended me yesterday, he legally terminated his own operational license. It was ironclad. My father whispered into the phone, asking the lawyer to draft an emergency injunction to force me to turn the servers back on. David let out a bitter laugh. He yelled that an injunction would require going in front of a federal judge today. The court would demand full discovery of the company's financial records, to prove damages. David warned Harrison that Andre's auditors were already in the lobby asking for access to the data rooms. He told my father that if they took this dispute to court, the entire financial history of Apex Logistics would become public record by tomorrow morning. David did not know about the fake marketing invoices yet, but Harrison knew. My father stared at the phone, realizing his lawyer had confirmed my exact threat. The intellectual property was secure and suing me would expose his criminal cover-up. He was trapped. David told Harrison he was officially resigning as general counsel, effective immediately. He stated he was not going down with a sinking ship and refused to be legally implicated in whatever massive operational failure Harrison had caused. The line went dead with a sharp click. My father looked at the blank phone screen. He had just lost his proprietary software, his operational capability, and his top corporate lawyer in 30 agonizing minutes. The foundation of his arrogance was destroyed. My mother began to cry. Ugly tears streamed down her face. She reached across the counter trying to grab my hand. She pleaded with me to turn the system back on to let the venture capital audit pass. She cried that we were a family and needed to protect Sydney. I stepped back disgusted by her emotional manipulation. I told her coldly that Sydney was a criminal and my father was her accomplice. I reminded them that less than 24 hours ago, they threw me out like garbage just to stroke Sydney's ego. I pointed toward my front door. I told them to get out of my apartment immediately before I called the police. I promised them that if they ever showed up uninvited again, I would send the encrypted financial logs straight to the authorities. They turned around in silence and walked out, leaving the door open behind them. I walked over, pushed the heavy wooden door shut, and locked the deadbolt. The quiet silence of my apartment returned, but this time it felt like victory. I picked up my cell phone. The trap was fully set, the general counsel had fled, and the golden child was about to walk right into her destruction. I stared at the blank screen of my cell phone, mentally calculating the exact amount of time it would take for my father to call Sydney and tell her that her secret was out. I estimated he would need 10 minutes to regain his composure in the lobby before making the call. I was wrong. It only took 4. The intercom on my wall did not buzz this time. Instead, I heard the distinct metallic scrape of a key sliding into my deadbolt. My blood ran cold. 3 years ago, when I first bought this apartment, I gave my parents an emergency spare key. I had completely forgotten they still had it. The heavy wooden door I had just shut swung open, violently crashing against the drywall and leaving a deep dent. Sydney marched into my foyer like a woman possessed. Her designer sunglasses were pushed up into her messy hair, and her usually flawless makeup was smeared. She was breathing heavily, clutching her phone in one hand and my spare apartment key in the other. My mother, Brenda, followed right behind her, having completely abandoned her previous act of crying. Brenda now wore a look of absolute venomous rage. But they were not alone. A large, broad-shouldered man in a cheap gray suit stepped into my apartment behind them, closing the door and standing directly in front of it to block my exit. Sydney pointed a shaking finger at me. She screamed that I was a lying, jealous sociopath. She demanded to know what kind of fabricated garbage I had just told our father about her marketing invoices. She told me she knew I was bluffing, but she was not going to let me ruin her reputation with Andre or the venture capital auditors. I did not back away. I looked at the large man blocking my door. I asked Sydney if she honestly thought hiring a low-rent private investigator to break into my home was a smart strategic move. My mother stepped forward, her heels clicking aggressively on the hardwood floor. She told me to shut my mouth. Brenda dropped the sweet, concerned mother routine entirely. She told me I had gone too far. She said I was trying to destroy the family business out of pure spite, because I was jealous of Sydney's marriage and success. Brenda threatened that if I did not sit down at my computer, unlock the Apex Logistics servers, and permanently delete whatever fake financial logs I claimed to possess, she would destroy my life. I asked her how she planned to do that. Brenda smiled a cold, terrifying smile. She said she would call the police and tell them I was having a severe mental breakdown. She threatened to tell the authorities that I was completely unhinged, threatening self-harm, and attempting to extort my own family. She said my father was already speaking with a new legal team to have me placed under a mandatory psychiatric hold. She promised to drain my bank accounts with endless litigation, drag my name through the local media, and make sure I never worked in the technology sector ever again. She called it a necessary intervention to protect the family from a rogue, unstable daughter. Sydney stepped closer, emboldened by our mother's vicious threats. Sydney ordered the large man in the suit to go into my home office and seize my laptop, my external hard drives, and any physical storage devices he could find. She told him I had stolen proprietary company data and he was authorized to retrieve it by any means necessary. The man grunted and took a heavy step toward the hallway leading to my office. I raised my right hand and spoke in a loud, commanding voice. I told the man to stop exactly where he was. I looked him dead in the eyes and informed him that he was currently standing inside a private residence without the owner's consent. I explained that Sydney did not own this property, she did not live here, and she had zero legal authority to permit him entry. I told him that if he took one more step toward my office, or if he touched a single piece of my electronic equipment, he would be committing felony residential burglary and strong arm robbery. The man hesitated. He looked back at Sydney, clearly confused by the legal reality I had just presented. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my cell phone. I tapped the screen and held it up. I told them all that my apartment was equipped with high-definition security cameras in the foyer, the kitchen, and the living room. I stated that every single threat my mother just made, every command Sydney just barked, and every physical step this man took was currently being recorded and automatically uploaded to a secure off-site cloud server. I lied about the cameras. I only had one small camera pointed at my dog's bed in the living room, but they did not know that. The private investigator immediately backed up. He raised his hands defensively and told Sydney he was hired to do a simple corporate document retrieval, not a home invasion. He stated clearly that he was not going to risk federal prison for a family dispute. He reached behind his back, turned the deadbolt, opened my front door, and walked out without another word. Sydney let out a frustrated scream, calling the man useless as he disappeared down the hallway. She turned back to me, her chest heaving with panic. The muscle she hired was gone. The physical threat was neutralized. I walked slowly toward Sydney and held out my hand. I demanded she give me my spare key. Sydney clutched the key tightly to her chest and refused. She screamed that she would not leave until I gave her the encrypted flash drive containing the financial logs. She pleaded, realizing the intimidation tactic had failed. She said Andre would divorce her if he found out about the money. She begged me to understand that she only took the funds because she needed to keep up appearances in her high society circle, and that our father had promised to pay it back using the venture capital money. She actually admitted the entire criminal conspiracy right there in my foyer. My mother tried to stop her from talking, grabbing Sydney's arm, but Sydney was in a state of total panic. I did not care about her excuses. I lunged forward, grabbed Sydney's wrist, and twisted it sharply. She gasped in shock and dropped the spare key onto the floor. I kicked the key behind me, stepped into Sydney's personal space, and pointed toward the open door. I told them both that their threats were pathetic. I told my mother she was a toxic enabler who was perfectly willing to have her own daughter committed to a psychiatric ward just to protect a thief. I told Sydney she was a fraud who was about to lose her husband, her job, and her freedom. I ordered them out of my home for the absolute final time. I promised them that if they did not step through that doorway in 3 seconds, I would call the police and have them arrested for trespassing. My mother glared at me with pure hatred, but she recognized she had lost. She grabbed Sydney by the shoulders and pulled her toward the exit. Sydney was sobbing uncontrollably now, all of her arrogance completely shattered. As they stepped out into the hallway, I slammed the door shut behind them. I locked the deadbolt, picked up the spare key from the floor, and threw it directly into the trash can. I leaned against the door, my heart pounding in my chest, completely ready for the legal war that was about to begin tomorrow. I walked away from the locked door and booted up my secured workstation. I knew my father too well to believe he would surrender after a failed home invasion. Harrison was a cornered animal, and cornered animals lash out blindly. Even though his general counsel had just resigned in terror, my father still had money and connections. I spent the evening organizing the server logs and duplicating the encrypted financial evidence onto 3 offline drives. I slept deeply and woke up at 6 in the morning, ready for the inevitable escalation. The attack arrived in my inbox exactly at 7:30. It was a severe red-flagged email from a prominent downtown litigation firm known for aggressive corporate bullying. The subject line read, "Urgent cease and desist notice of imminent injunctive relief." I opened the attachment while sipping my morning coffee. The document was 50 pages of pure legal fiction. The new lawyer, a man named Sterling, claimed my LLC was a dummy corporation used to fraudulently extort Apex Logistics. He demanded immediate restoration of all server access by 9 o'clock, or he would march into federal court and file a temporary restraining order. He threatened me with $10 million in operational damages, citing disrupted supply chains and stranded trucking fleets. The letter was designed to terrify a normal person into immediate submission. It was filled with heavy legal jargon, terrifying financial penalties, and direct threats of criminal prosecution for cyber sabotage. But I was not a normal person, and I had written the underlying software contracts myself. I read the aggressive demands and actually laughed out loud. The entire document was a desperate hollow bluff built on a foundation of lies my father told his new attorney. Harrison clearly omitted critical facts when he hired this bulldog lawyer. He definitely did not show Sterling the month-to-month licensing agreement he signed 5 years ago. He certainly did not mention that he suspended me without cause, which legally triggered the system lockout. And he absolutely did not confess that his other daughter had embezzled $1.5 million. My father simply pointed a finger at me and claimed I was a rogue hacker holding his precious company hostage. I did not reply to the email with a long defense. I did not hire my own legal team to draft a counter-argument. I simply clicked the reply button and typed a single sentence. I told Sterling I would be happy to discuss his demands on a video conference call at 8:15, and I provided a secure link. I hit send and waited. At 8:15, my computer chimed. I admitted the caller into the secure video room. The screen split in two. On one side sat Sterling wearing a sharp pinstripe suit and sitting in a lavish glass office. He had a look of arrogant confidence plastered across his face. On the other side of the screen sat my father. Harrison looked like he had not slept. His skin was pale, his eyes bloodshot, and he kept nervously wiping sweat from his forehead. He refused to make eye contact with the camera. Sterling immediately took control of the meeting. He leaned into his microphone and began speaking in a deep, authoritative voice. He told me I was in violation of federal commerce laws. He stated, unless I handed over the administrative passwords in 10 minutes, federal marshals would be knocking on my door. I let him finish his dramatic monologue. When he finally paused, I shared my screen. I did not show him passwords. I displayed a high-resolution scan of the original software licensing agreement from 5 years ago. I highlighted the signature at the bottom of the page. It was Harrison's distinct, sloppy handwriting. I asked Sterling if his client provided this document during their consultation. Sterling squinted at the screen, his arrogant expression faltering. I pointed directly to Section 4, Paragraph 2. I read the clause aloud. Any suspension of the primary administrative officer without cause instantly revokes the licensing agreement and terminates all server access. I stopped sharing my screen and looked directly at the lawyer. I informed him that I was the primary administrative officer and my father suspended me yesterday morning in front of the executive board. Sterling quickly turned his head to glare at my father. He clearly had not been informed about the suspension or the signed contract. But Sterling was a professional bully, so he quickly recovered and tried to pivot. He argued that the contract was unconscionable and stated he could easily get a judge to throw it out. He reiterated his threat to file the emergency injunction to force the servers back online for the venture capital audit today. I smiled warmly at him. I told him he was absolutely welcome to file for an injunction, but I reminded him of a basic legal requirement. I told Sterling that filing an emergency federal injunction requires the plaintiff to sign a sworn affidavit declaring they come to court with clean hands, meaning they have committed no internal breaches or fraudulent acts themselves. Sterling narrowed his eyes and asked what I was implying. I did not imply anything. I stated a cold, hard fact. I told the lawyer that if he filed that injunction, I would immediately submit the results of my automated security audit during discovery. I told him I had concrete encrypted proof that the vice president of sales embezzled $1.5 million through fake vendor invoices, and that the chief executive officer had personally overridden the accounting flags to cover it up. I watched the blood drain from Sterling's face. He froze. He was an aggressive corporate lawyer, but he was not suicidal. He instantly understood the catastrophic legal trap his client pushed him into. If Sterling filed documents claiming his client was innocent, while knowing about a massive financial fraud, Sterling would commit perjury and risk his license to practice law. Sterling turned slowly to look at my father. The lawyer's aggressive posture was completely gone, replaced by a cold, calculating glare. He asked Harrison a single pointed question. He asked if I was telling the truth about the $1.5 million. My father swallowed hard. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. His silence was a deafening confession. Sterling did not need to hear anything else. The lawyer reached forward and hit a button on his keyboard. He announced that his firm was formally withdrawing as counsel for Apex Logistics, effective immediately. He stated that he would not risk his law license or face federal perjury charges for a client who lied during intake and concealed massive financial fraud. Sterling warned Harrison never to contact his office again. The lawyer disconnected his feed and his half of the video screen went black. My father sat alone on the remaining video feed. He looked utterly destroyed. He had tried intimidation. He had tried a physical home invasion. He had tried hiring a ruthless corporate bulldog. Every single aggressive tactic had backfired spectacularly, leaving him completely exposed. He stared into his webcam with hollow eyes. He pleaded with me. He said Andre and the Horizon Ventures audit team were arriving in 45 minutes. He begged me to just hide the financial ledgers. He promised he would fire Sydney today and give me full control of the company if I just helped him secure the $10 million venture capital fund to replace the stolen money. I looked at the man who had spent my entire life treating me like disposable machinery. I told him he had 20 minutes to confess to Andre before I did it for him. I clicked end call and closed the application. With the legal bluff entirely dismantled, I needed to solidify the evidence. I turned my attention back to my secure workstation. It was time to complete the shadow audit. I had already identified the total amount missing, but I needed to build a waterproof digital paper trail showing exactly how Sydney orchestrated the theft. Andre was a meticulous venture capitalist. If I was going to hand him a nuclear bomb to drop on his own marriage and his own investment, the data had to be flawless. I opened the encrypted logs I had pulled from the back-end integration. I bypassed the standard accounting dashboards and went straight into the raw database queries. Sydney was not a technical genius, which meant she did not build this embezzlement scheme alone. She exploited a basic workflow rule. Company policy dictated that any vendor invoice under $50,000 did not require secondary executive approval. It only needed a signature from a department head. Since Sydney was the vice president of sales, she had full authorization to approve her own departmental expenses. I traced the routing numbers attached to the fraudulent payments. Over the course of 14 months, Sydney had submitted 35 separate invoices. Each invoice was carefully drafted for exactly $48,500. She kept every single theft just under the automatic security threshold. The invoices were made out to 3 different limited liability companies registered in Delaware. I ran a quick corporate registry search on my secondary monitor. The shell companies had incredibly generic names like Apex Marketing Synergy and Global Reach Consultancies. They had no websites, no physical office locations, and no listed employees. The only thing they had were registered digital bank accounts. Sydney was funneling $48,000 every 2 weeks into these ghost companies under the disguise of digital advertising spend and lead generation services. She was bleeding the operating budget dry while producing zero actual sales results. But the most damning part of the shadow audit was not Sydney's predictable theft. It was the digital fingerprint left by my father. 2 months ago, the total volume of external marketing spend triggered a secondary security protocol I had quietly built into the Aegis software. The system recognized that the sales department was burning through cash at an unsustainable rate without generating a proportional increase in revenue. The software automatically flagged the Delaware Shell Company accounts and froze the outgoing payments pending a CEO review. That was the moment Harrison found out. He could have fired her. He could have called the authorities. Instead, he made a catastrophic choice. I pulled up the specific server log from that Tuesday in October. The log clearly showed Harrison's unique executive administrative token logging into the financial portal at 11 at night. I found the exact keystrokes. He did not initiate an internal investigation. He manually executed a global override command. He permanently cleared the security flag, whitelisted the 3 Delaware shell companies, and authorized the release of the frozen funds. He actively chose to become an accessory to federal wire fraud to protect his golden child. He sacrificed the financial stability of the entire company and the livelihoods of 50 employees just to keep Sydney from facing the consequences of her actions. I exported the complete shadow audit into a single encrypted digital dossier. I included the raw database logs, the IP address matches linking the invoice submissions directly to Sydney's corporate laptop, and the executive token data proving Harrison's cover-up. I saved the dossier onto a fresh silver flash drive. I checked the clock on my wall. It was 8:45 in the morning. Andre and his team of forensic accountants were scheduled to walk into the Apex logistics lobby in exactly 15 minutes. Suddenly, a red warning banner flashed across my secondary monitor. The Aegis system was alerting me to a brute force intrusion attempt. Someone at the Apex office was frantically trying to access the local backup servers to wipe the financial drives before Andre arrived. They were trying to destroy the evidence. I watched the frantic digital pings hitting my firewall. It was a pathetic, desperate move. They did not understand that the local drives were already completely empty. I had migrated all core data to my private cloud servers the moment the dead man's switch activated. I simply blocked their IP address and watched the intrusion alerts go dead. They were out of options, out of time, and entirely out of luck. I grabbed my coat and the silver flash drive. It was time to hand-deliver the truth. I stepped out of my apartment and locked the deadbolt. The silver flash drive felt heavy in my pocket. My original plan was to march directly into the Apex logistics lobby and hand the encrypted dossier straight to Andre in front of his team. It would have been a spectacular explosion. But my analytical mind took over. Dropping a bomb in a crowded lobby was sloppy. Andre was a man of absolute precision. He despised public scenes and emotional outbursts. If I wanted him to truly understand the betrayal, I needed to present the evidence flawlessly. I realized I had an incomplete data set. I had proven that Sydney stole the money and our father covered it up. But I had not yet answered the most important financial question. Where exactly did $1.5 million go? I drove downtown but avoided the corporate headquarters. Instead, I parked 3 blocks away and walked into a quiet coffee shop. I ordered a black coffee, sat at a corner table facing the door, and opened my laptop. I connected to my private encrypted mobile hotspot. I needed to trace the shell companies before I confronted anyone. Sydney was incredibly arrogant, but she was not a financial mastermind. She used a generic online legal service to incorporate her fake businesses in Delaware. Delaware is notoriously secretive, offering corporate anonymity that shields true owners from public registry searches. But Sydney made a critical mistake. She funded the initial incorporation fees using her personal credit card. I accessed the financial routing databases I utilized for corporate security audits. It took me less than 10 minutes to pierce the corporate veil she thought was impenetrable. I pulled the digital incorporation certificates for Apex Marketing Synergy and Global Reach consultancies. The registered agent was a generic digital mailbox service, but the initial billing receipt was stamped with a Visa card ending in 4 distinct digits. I recognized those digits immediately. It was the same credit card she used to buy my birthday present 2 years ago. The paper trail was established, but I needed to follow the actual money. I ran a deep query on the routing numbers attached to the Delaware bank accounts. The $1.5 million did not stay in Delaware. The moment the funds were deposited from the Apex Logistics operating account, they were immediately wired out. I tracked the digital ledgers. The money was routed directly back to Chicago, but it did not go into a standard checking account. It was funneled into a private wealth management portfolio registered under a discrete holding trust. The trust was named after our grandmother. It was a sickening detail using a beloved family name to hide stolen corporate funds. I bypassed the bank's front-end security by analyzing the open API ports they used for mobile banking. I could see the transaction history clearly on my screen. The spending log was a masterclass in narcissistic delusion. I scrolled through months of outrageous transactions. Sydney had not invested the stolen money. She had burned it to fuel a fake lifestyle. I found multiple wire transfers to a luxury real estate broker in Aspen, Colorado. She had purchased an $800,000 vacation condo in cash. I found $50,000 payments to high-end interior designers. I saw continuous massive charges at luxury boutiques in Paris and Milan. There were receipts for chartering private jets for weekend trips with her high society friends. She was living the life of a billionaire heiress on a stolen Midwestern software budget. The most revealing part was understanding why she did it. Andre was extremely wealthy, but he was a self-made man who valued financial discipline. He famously refused to fund frivolous, ostentatious lifestyles. He kept his venture capital earnings strictly separated and invested in solid assets. Sydney wanted to impress the wives of other executives. She wanted the designer bags, the private flights, and the Aspen properties, but her husband refused to buy them for her. So she stole from our father's company to fund her illusion, knowing that Harrison was too weak to ever stop her. She was a parasite perfectly adapted to feed on our father's desperate need for a golden child. I compiled this new information into a separate folder on my desktop. I dragged the property deeds, the wire transfer logs, and the luxury retail receipts into the dossier. I transferred it onto the silver flash drive. The picture was finally complete. Not only was she a corporate thief, but she was entirely broke. She had spent almost every single dollar she stole. The shell companies were completely empty. There was no way for our father to quietly recover the funds, even if he wanted to. Apex Logistics was carrying a massive, unrecoverable debt that would instantly trigger federal bankruptcy the moment the venture capital audit discovered it. I closed my laptop and slid the silver flash drive back into my coat pocket. I checked my watch. The Horizon Ventures audit team was currently sitting in the dark boardroom of Apex Logistics, waiting for servers that would never turn back on. My father was undoubtedly sweating through his suit, making up pathetic lies to stall them. I took a sip of my coffee, feeling a deep sense of absolute calm. My cell phone buzzed on the table. The caller ID flashed with Sydney's name. I let it ring. It stopped and a text message immediately popped up on my screen. The message was incredibly frantic. It read, "Meet me at the Capitol Grill in 20 minutes. I know what you want. Please do not talk to Andre." I stared at the screen. She was completely out of moves. Her legal threats failed. Now she was resorting to bribery. I picked up my phone, did not reply, and stood up from the table. I walked out of the coffee shop and headed toward my car. It was finally time to finish this destructive game. I drove the short distance to the Capitol Grill and parked. The heavy wooden doors of the restaurant swung open to reveal a dimly lit dining room that smelled intensely of expensive aged steak and desperate corporate money. Because it was barely 9 in the morning, the massive restaurant was completely empty except for the waitstaff quietly setting up for the early lunch rush. And Sydney. She was sitting entirely alone in a deep leather corner booth. She wore a pristine white Chanel blazer, clearly attempting to project an image of wealth and control. But her posture gave her away. She was hunched over the polished wooden table, aggressively shredding a paper cocktail napkin into tiny, nervous pieces. I walked across the plush carpet. My footsteps made no sound, so she did not notice me until I slid into the booth directly across from her. Sydney jumped slightly, her eyes wide behind her designer eyelashes. She looked absolutely exhausted. The arrogant smirk she wore in the boardroom yesterday was entirely gone. She quickly brushed the shredded napkin off the table and tried to sit up straight, forcing a look of superiority back onto her face. I leaned back against the leather seat and looked at her. I told her she looked terrible. I asked her how the venture capital audit was going over at the corporate office. Sydney narrowed her eyes and told me to cut the crap. She said she did not have time to play these stupid hacker games with me. She stated that our father had already briefed her on the ridiculous software stunt I pulled and the absurd lies I told him about the financial integration. She claimed she was here to offer an olive branch because she was the bigger person and wanted to save the family business from my hysterical mental breakdown. I smiled at her delusion. She was sitting on top of a massive felony, completely bankrupt, and still trying to act like she held the high ground. Sydney reached into her expensive leather handbag and pulled out a crisp white envelope. She slid it across the smooth wooden table. It stopped exactly halfway between us. She tapped her perfectly manicured fingernail against the paper. She told me it was a cashier's check for exactly $50,000. She called it a retroactive performance bonus. I looked at the envelope, but I did not touch it. I asked her what the money was actually for. She leaned forward, dropping her voice to a harsh whisper. She said all I had to do was log into my laptop right now and turn the Apex Logistics servers back on before Andre arrived at the office. She demanded I write the apology email to the executive board, officially resign my position as chief operating officer, and walk away quietly. She told me to take the money, go start a new life somewhere else, and consider it a massive win. She promised that if I agreed, the family would generously choose not to press federal charges against me for cyber extortion. I stared at the envelope. $50,000. It was a substantial amount of money to a normal person, but it was an absolute insult coming from someone who had just embezzled 30 times that amount. I asked her a very simple question. I asked her which shell company she routed the $50,000 from. I asked if she pulled it from Apex Marketing Synergy or Global Reach Consultancies. All the color instantly drained from Sydney's face. Her arrogant sneer collapsed into genuine, unadulterated terror. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She stared at me, her eyes darting back and forth, as if trying to calculate exactly how much I knew. I did not give her time to think. I leaned in close and kept my voice perfectly calm and level. I told her I knew about the 35 fake vendor invoices. I told her I knew she kept every single fraudulent payment exactly under the $48,500 security threshold. I told her I tracked the routing numbers to Delaware, traced her personal credit card, used for the initial incorporation fees, and followed the wire transfers straight into the private wealth management trust she named after our dead grandmother. Sydney began to tremble. Her hands shook so violently she had to place them flat on the table to steady herself. She whispered that I did not know what I was talking about. She sounded like a frightened child. I ignored her weak denial. I told her I also pulled the spending logs from the trust account. I congratulated her on the new condo in Aspen. I asked her if the high-end interior designers in Milan were worth destroying our father's entire company. I stated clearly that I knew the money was entirely gone. The shell companies were empty, the trust account was drained, and she was completely broke. Sydney let out a choked, desperate sob. Tears finally spilled over her designer eyelashes, ruining her makeup. She grabbed the edge of the table. She begged me to keep my voice down. She confessed everything in a frantic rush of words. She said she only took the money because she felt inadequate next to Andre's massive wealth. She claimed she needed the designer clothes and luxury trips just to feel worthy of standing next to him at corporate events. She said our father caught her 2 months ago, but he promised they could use Andre's $10 million venture capital injection to silently replace the stolen funds before anyone noticed. She pushed the white envelope closer to me. She pleaded with me to take the $50,000. She swore she would pay me more later. She said if Andre found out she was a thief, he would not just cancel the funding, he would divorce her immediately and leave her with absolutely nothing at all. I laughed. It was not a gentle, forgiving chuckle. It was a cold, sharp sound that echoed loudly across the polished mahogany walls and empty leather booths of the dining room. I looked at the pathetic white envelope sitting on the table. $50,000. It was the ultimate proof that my sister fundamentally did not understand the gravity of her situation. She genuinely believed she could buy her way out of a federal crime with a tiny fraction of the money she had not yet managed to waste. I slid the envelope back across the smooth wooden surface until it tapped against her expensive designer handbag. I told her to keep it. I told her she was going to need every single penny to retain a decent criminal defense attorney. Sydney stared at the rejected envelope, her chest heaving as she struggled to catch her breath. She opened her mouth to offer more empty promises, but a new sound interrupted her. It was the heavy, rhythmic thud of expensive leather dress shoes walking purposefully across the plush restaurant carpet. The footsteps bypassed the host stand entirely and headed directly toward our secluded corner booth. Sydney froze. Her bloodshot eyes widened in absolute horror as she looked past my shoulder. I turned my head slowly. Standing at the edge of our table, blocking the only exit from the booth, was Andre. He looked immaculate, dressed in a custom-tailored charcoal suit that projected quiet, aggressive authority. But his face was completely devoid of its usual polished corporate charm. His jaw was clenched tight, and his dark eyes were scanning the scene with the terrifying clinical precision of an apex predator analyzing injured prey. He looked at Sydney's ruined makeup and tear-stained face. He looked at my perfectly calm expression. And finally, his piercing gaze locked onto the white envelope sitting between us on the table. The silence in the restaurant became instantly suffocating. Neither Sydney nor I said a single word. Andre did not raise his voice. He did not yell or create a public spectacle. He simply stated that my father was currently sweating through his shirt in the Apex Logistics boardroom, telling the venture capital audit team that the primary servers were offline due to a sudden electrical fire. Andre explained that he found it highly suspicious that the chief operating officer and the vice president of sales were having a secret, tearful meeting at an expensive steakhouse during a supposedly critical company emergency. He checked his heavy silver watch. He stated he had used the emergency GPS tracker on Sydney's luxury SUV to pinpoint her location. He demanded to know exactly what was going on, and he demanded the truth right now. Sydney panicked. Her survival instincts kicked in, overriding her sheer terror with a desperate need to manipulate the narrative. She quickly grabbed the white envelope and shoved it deep into her handbag out of sight. She reached out and touched Andre's arm, forcing a frantic, watery smile onto her face. She lied straight to his face, without hesitation. She told him that I was having a severe mental breakdown. She claimed I had deliberately sabotaged the company servers out of pure jealousy because I found out she was getting a massive promotion. She said she came here to secretly offer me a generous severance package from her own personal savings just to make me go away and save the venture capital deal. It was a spectacular performance, but it was entirely fabricated. Andre did not look at his wife. He did not pull his arm away, but he did not offer any comfort either. He kept his dark, intense eyes locked entirely on me. He was a ruthless venture capitalist who made a living destroying companies that tried to deceive him. He could smell desperation in a boardroom, and Sydney was reeking of it. He asked me directly if my sister was telling the truth. He asked if I was holding my father's company hostage for a lucrative payout. I leaned back into the deep leather booth and maintained unblinking eye contact with my brother-in-law. I told him Sydney was lying. I told him there was no electrical fire at the corporate office and there was absolutely no server malfunction. I explained that the entire digital system was locked in a permanent automated blackout because Harrison had blatantly violated the core terms of my proprietary software licensing agreement by suspending me without cause. I watched Andre rapidly process this new information. His eyes narrowed. He was a brilliant man, and he was beginning to realize the entire foundation of his $10 million investment was a massive, fragile illusion. Sydney practically shrieked. She interrupted me aggressively, telling Andre not to listen to my crazy hacking conspiracy theories. She begged him to leave the restaurant with her immediately so they could go back to the office and help her father fix the fake electrical issue. She tried to stand up, attempting to physically block Andre from speaking to me any further. Andre simply put a firm hand on her shoulder and pushed her roughly back down into the leather seat. He did not even look at her as she gasped in shock. He spoke to me again, his voice dropping to a dangerously quiet, commanding tone. He asked me why my father would deliberately violate a binding software contract and trigger a company-wide blackout on the exact morning of a massive financial audit. I reached slowly into my coat pocket. I bypassed all the verbal explanations and defensive arguments. I pulled out the small silver flash drive and placed it directly in the center of the polished wooden table. I told Andre that my father locked the system because he was terrified of what the forensic audit team would find in the back-end ledgers. I told him this drive contained the complete unedited shadow audit of the Apex Logistics financial architecture. I stated clearly that it held the encrypted database logs, the fake vendor invoices, the Delaware Shell Company corporate registries, and the luxury wire transfer receipts. Andre stared intensely at the small silver device sitting between us. He slowly reached into his tailored suit jacket and produced a sleek, ultra-thin tablet. He flipped it open and set it on the table right next to the flash drive. He looked at me one final time, asking if I was absolutely certain about the severity of what he was going to see. I nodded once. I told him the drive proved exactly why Apex Logistics desperately needed his $10 million injection today. I told him it proved that his wife had embezzled $1.5 million, and that our father had personally overridden the executive security protocols to cover it up. Sydney let out a horrifying guttural gasp. She lunged violently across the table, her perfectly manicured hands clawing frantically toward the silver drive. She was completely unhinged, willing to physically destroy the evidence right there in a public restaurant. Andre reacted with terrifying speed. He caught her wrist in a brutal vice grip, stopping her hand mere inches from the drive. He did not say a single word to her. He simply shoved her arm away in disgust and picked up the flash drive. He plugged it directly into the side port of his tablet. The screen immediately illuminated, displaying the highly organized encrypted folders of the shadow audit. Andre tapped the glass screen, opening the first folder labeled Delaware Shell Companies. The game was officially over. The soft blue light illuminated Andre's face as he scanned the digital documents. He scrolled through the incorporation certificates with clinical efficiency. The restaurant was perfectly silent, except for his fingers swiping across the glass. Sydney sat frozen in her seat, watching her carefully constructed life disintegrate in real time. Andre opened the subfolders containing the 35 fraudulent vendor invoices. He matched the routing numbers and saw the exact dollar amounts kept meticulously under the secondary executive approval threshold. His jaw muscles clenched as the undeniable reality of his wife's corporate theft washed over him. He built an empire on identifying financial risk, and the greatest liability of his career was currently sitting across from him in a ruined Chanel blazer. Andre tapped the folder labeled Private Wealth Management Trust. He opened the ledger tracking the wire transfers to Chicago and saw the trust account registered under our grandmother's name. His eyes narrowed sharply at that sickening emotional manipulation. He scrolled down to the expenditure logs. He saw the $800,000 Aspen vacation condo purchased in cash. He saw the interior design fees, the private jet charters, and the endless retail charges from Milan and Paris. For the first time since he walked into the restaurant, Andre looked up from the tablet. He slowly locked his dark, furious eyes on Sydney. She shrank back against the leather booth, pressing herself as far away from him as possible. Andre's voice was dangerously quiet, carrying a cold, razor-sharp edge. He asked if she actually thought he was stupid. He asked if she truly believed she could funnel $1.5 million of stolen corporate capital into a fake lifestyle without him noticing. He stated he had explicitly refused to buy her the Aspen property because it was a toxic asset. He realized she had simply stolen from her father to bypass his boundaries. Sydney completely fell apart. The last shred of her arrogant facade shattered. She reached across the table with trembling hands, trying to grab his sleeve. She wept hysterically, tears ruining her makeup and dripping onto her pristine white blazer. She babbled a pathetic stream of excuses, blaming the immense pressure of their high society social circle. When Andre remained stone-faced and unresponsive, she turned her desperate, venomous gaze toward me. She screamed that I fabricated the entire dossier. She claimed I forged the IP addresses and planted the receipts just to destroy her marriage out of spite. Andre did not tolerate the hysterical outburst. He slammed his hand flat down on the mahogany table. The sudden sound echoed through the empty dining room like a gunshot, instantly silencing Sydney. He told her to shut her mouth. He stated the digital forensic trail was flawless, and he knew a legitimate dataset when he saw one. He stood up from the booth, his towering frame casting a long shadow over the table. He reached into his suit jacket and pulled out his cell phone. He dialed a number, never taking his eyes off Sydney. When the line picked up, Andre spoke with absolute ruthless authority. He addressed the head of his forensic accounting team, currently waiting in the dark boardroom at the Apex Logistics headquarters. Andre issued a direct command. He told his lead auditor to pack up all their equipment immediately. He instructed the team to walk out of the building without saying a single word to Harrison or any other executive. He officially declared the $10 million venture capital deal dead on arrival. He stated Apex Logistics was a fraudulent enterprise and Horizon Ventures was severing all ties. The magnitude of what just happened finally crushed Sydney. With a single phone call, Andre had annihilated our father's last desperate hope of survival. The $10 million lifeline was gone. Apex Logistics was holding a massive unrecoverable debt, and the system lockout meant they could not operate their daily shipping routes to generate revenue. The company was going to bleed out in a matter of days. Sydney buried her face in her hands and sobbed loudly, realizing she had destroyed her family legacy and her marriage. Andre picked up his tablet and the silver flash drive. He looked at me. His expression shifted from raw anger to a cold, calculating respect. He acknowledged the absolute precision of my execution. He recognized I timed the server blackout perfectly to force the financial discrepancies into the light precisely when the company was most vulnerable. He asked me a simple, direct question. He asked what my ultimate objective was now that the company was bleeding to death. I maintained my steady composure. I told Andre Apex Logistics was fundamentally broken, but the underlying supply chain network and client contracts were highly valuable assets. I explained the current executive board was a liability led by a CEO who covered up a massive felony. I told him my objective was a complete hostile takeover. I stated the emergency board meeting was scheduled for tomorrow morning. At that meeting, I would present the shadow audit to the voting shareholders. I would force my father's immediate resignation and demand full executive control of the company. Andre nodded slowly, understanding the sheer ruthlessness of the strategy. He appreciated a hostile takeover built on undeniable leverage. He slipped the tablet under his arm. He looked down at Sydney, who was weeping uncontrollably into her hands. He told her his legal team would contact her by the end of the day to begin immediate divorce proceedings. He advised her to use the $50,000 cashier check to hire a very good criminal defense lawyer because he was legally obligated to report the wire fraud to federal authorities. Andre turned and walked out of the restaurant, his heavy footsteps fading into the distance. I was left alone with the shattered remains of my sister. The board meeting was tomorrow morning, and I finally had absolutely everything I needed to take my rightful throne. Sydney sat paralyzed in the leather booth, her face buried in her hands. She was a broken shell of the executive who had tried to bribe me minutes ago. I did not offer her a tissue, and I did not offer her a single word of comfort. She dug this inescapable grave with her own hands, and our father willingly handed her the shovel. I picked up my phone, slid it into my coat pocket, and walked away. I pushed through the heavy wooden doors and stepped into the freezing morning air. My mind was already moving past Sydney, focusing entirely on the logistics of the hostile takeover. The emergency board meeting was scheduled for 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. I had the encrypted shadow audit and irrevocable proof of executive fraud. But a hostile takeover required legally binding votes. Apex Logistics was privately held. Harrison held 40%. Sydney held 10. I held 10. The remaining 40% was divided equally among four silent minority shareholders. They were wealthy conservative investors who backed my father 20 years ago. They were ruthless businessmen who cared only about extracting maximum profit. If I detonated the company with a scandal, they would lose everything. I needed a structural solution to replace the impending wreckage. I drove straight back to my apartment and booted up my workstation. I needed to draft a binding term sheet for a new corporate entity. I would offer the minority shareholders a direct equity swap. If they voted to remove Harrison and Sydney, installing me as chief executive officer, I would legally transfer their current shares into a newly formed, highly secure holding company. This new company would own the exclusive rights to the Aegis Tech Solutions software. I was offering a golden life raft. They could sink with my father's fraudulent management or sail into a highly profitable, fully automated future. As I finished typing the legal clauses, my cell phone buzzed against the wooden desk. It was an encrypted out-of-state number. I answered the call. Andre's deep, authoritative voice came through the speaker. He had not called to vent about his impending high-profile divorce. He was a ruthless venture capitalist operating strictly on cold business logic. He informed me his forensic accounting team spent the last 2 hours verifying the raw data on my flash drive. He explicitly confirmed that my shadow audit was absolutely flawless. He already dispatched corporate lawyers to freeze all joint bank accounts he held with Sydney and formally notified federal authorities regarding her wire fraud. Then Andre smoothly shifted the entire direction of the conversation. He told me he was reviewing the historical revenue charts of Apex Logistics before the server blackout occurred. He acknowledged my proprietary software had single-handedly reduced operating overhead by 22% in less than 2 years. The core supply chain network was a highly lucrative asset currently suffocated by negligent mismanagement. Andre did not want to walk away from a profitable sector. He wanted to pivot his investment strategy and partner with the real architect of the business. He proposed a mutually beneficial deal. Horizon Ventures would completely withdraw their $10 million emergency funding offer from Harrison. However, if I successfully executed the hostile takeover tomorrow morning and officially secured the position of Chief Executive Officer, Horizon Ventures would immediately offer me a $15 million line of credit. The capital would absorb the $1.5 million debt Sydney created and aggressively expand the Aegis software licensing to external logistics firms nationwide. In exchange, Andre wanted a 20% equity stake in my new holding company. It was a brilliant maneuver. Andre was masterfully turning a devastating personal betrayal into a massive financial victory. I leaned back in my desk chair and considered the offer. Having a $15 million venture capital backing would instantly silence any lingering hesitation from the 4 minority shareholders. It transformed my hostile takeover from a risky internal corporate coup into a fully funded corporate evolution. But I was not going to hand over 20% of my proprietary software system without establishing unbreakable boundaries. I kept my voice professional. I told Andre I would accept his generous capital injection under one strictly non-negotiable condition. I demanded a legally binding clause stating Horizon Ventures would hold entirely non-voting shares for the first 5 years of the partnership. I would retain absolute operational control of the new company. He could reap the financial rewards of my labor, but he would have zero say in daily management decisions. I expected him to argue. Instead, he let out a laugh of genuine respect. He agreed to the terms immediately. He promised to have his top legal team draft the preliminary term sheet and email it directly to my secure server within the hour. I ended the call and smiled. The chessboard was set and every moving piece was perfectly locked into place. I spent the remainder of the afternoon printing high-resolution copies of the shadow audit, placing them meticulously into thick black binders for the minority shareholders. I printed the new corporate equity swap agreements. I printed the $15 million venture capital term sheet from Horizon Ventures. I packed everything securely into my sleek leather briefcase, snapping the heavy metal locks shut. When the sun finally went down, I stood by my living room window and looked out at the glowing city skyline. Tomorrow morning, Harrison was going to walk into that boardroom, fully expecting to fight a rebellious daughter over a simple, easily resolved software dispute. He had absolutely no idea that I was walking in with a weaponized federal fraud case, a signed venture capital alliance, and a flawless legal mechanism to instantly strip him of his entire legacy. I turned away from the glass window and set my alarm clock for 6 o'clock sharp. The era of being the disposable family scapegoat was officially over. The alarm tone shattered the silence of my bedroom at exactly 6 in the morning. I did not hit snooze. I opened my eyes and stared at the dark ceiling, feeling a profound sense of clarity. Today was execution day. I threw off the covers and walked into the bathroom, turning the shower handle all the way to cold. The freezing water hit my skin like a physical shock, instantly clearing away any lingering traces of hesitation. I stood under the icy stream, mentally reviewing every data point in the black binders. There was no room for error. The minority shareholders were ruthless pragmatists. They would not vote to dethrone a founder based on emotional family drama. They would only vote for undeniable financial superiority. I stepped out of the shower and walked into my closet. I bypassed the standard corporate gray suits I usually wore to blend into the background of my father's shadow. Today, I was not playing the role of the dutiful, invisible daughter. I pulled out a sharp, tailored navy blue blazer and a crisp white silk blouse. I paired it with a structured skirt and black leather heels that clicked sharply against the hardwood floor. It was armor designed for a modern corporate war. I applied my makeup with clinical precision, locking away any trace of vulnerability. I looked at my reflection in the full-length mirror. The woman staring back at me was no longer a disposable scapegoat. She was the architect of a $15 million coup. I walked into the living room and picked up the heavy leather briefcase sitting on my desk. The metal locks gleamed in the early morning light. Inside rested the absolute destruction of Harrison's legacy, neatly organized in encrypted drives and perfectly bound pages. I walked out of my apartment, locked the deadbolt, and took the elevator down to the parking garage. The drive downtown was incredibly peaceful. The city was just beginning to wake up, bathed in a cold gray morning light. The quiet streets stood in sharp contrast to the absolute chaos I knew was currently unfolding at the Apex Logistics headquarters. I pulled into the corporate parking lot at 7:15. The physical consequences of my digital blackout were immediately visible. The massive loading docks, usually swarming with activity, were completely dead. A line of 18-wheeler trucks was backed up to the street entrance. Drivers were standing outside their cabs, smoking cigarettes and arguing with panicked warehouse managers holding useless paper clipboards. The automated routing algorithms were entirely offline. Nobody knew what cargo was supposed to go where. The company was bleeding hundreds of thousands of dollars in delayed shipping penalties by the hour. It was a beautiful display of my leverage. I parked in my designated executive spot and walked toward the main glass entrance. The lobby was a war zone. Dozens of logistics coordinators were milling around the front desk, staring at blank computer monitors. The moment I walked through the sliding glass doors, the ambient noise in the room completely vanished. Every single head turned to look at me. They knew I was the chief operating officer, and they knew I built the software paralyzing their jobs. A senior logistics manager stepped forward looking absolutely exhausted. He pleaded with me, asking when the servers would be back online, stating clients were threatening to cancel massive seasonal contracts. I did not stop walking. I did not offer him a false apology or a weak excuse. I maintained a brisk, purposeful stride directly toward the secure executive elevators. I looked at the manager and spoke in a clear, loud voice that carried across the silent lobby. I told him the system outage would be permanently resolved in exactly 1 hour. I instructed him to have all warehouse teams on standby to immediately resume routing protocols the moment the servers rebooted. A collective sigh of relief washed through the crowd, but I was already gone, swiping my keycard and stepping into the private elevator. The heavy steel doors slid shut, cutting off the panic below. The ride up to the top floor was agonizingly slow, but my heart rate remained perfectly steady. The doors opened onto the executive suite. Unlike the frantic lobby, this floor was suffocatingly quiet. The thick carpet absorbed the sound of my heels. The receptionist's desk was empty. My father had clearly ordered all support staff away from the boardroom to keep this disaster contained. I walked down the long mahogany-paneled hallway. The air felt heavy, charged with the nervous energy of a cornered animal. I reached the massive double doors of the main conference room. I did not knock. I placed both hands on the brass handles and pushed them wide open. The boardroom was vast and imposing, bathed in cold fluorescent light. The 4 minority shareholders were already seated along the right side of the massive walnut table. These were wealthy, impatient men in their late 60s who absolutely hated having their time wasted. They looked angry, confused, and deeply suspicious about the sudden emergency meeting and the total operational blackout affecting their bottom line. At the head of the table sat my father. Harrison looked like a man who had aged 10 years in a single night. His expensive tailored suit was wrinkled, his silk tie was pulled loose, and his eyes were bloodshot from severe sleep deprivation. He was frantically shuffling a thick stack of printed financial projections, desperate to retain control. The plush leather chair to his immediate right, traditionally reserved for the vice president of sales, was completely empty. Sydney was not coming. Every eye in the room locked onto me the second I stepped through the heavy doors. Harrison stopped shuffling his papers. His jaw clenched, and a flash of pure hatred crossed his exhausted face. He fully expected me to slink into my usual chair at the far end of the table and silently surrender my leverage. I did not walk to the far end. I walked directly to the center of the room, demanding their absolute attention. I placed my heavy leather briefcase squarely on the polished walnut surface, right in front of the minority shareholders. The storm had finally arrived. The metallic click of the briefcase latches echoed through the massive boardroom like a gunshot. I flipped the heavy leather lid open, but I did not take a seat. I stood firmly at the center of the table, commanding the physical space. Harrison immediately shot out of his chair at the head of the table. His face flushed a deep, dangerous crimson. He slammed his hand flat against his printed financial projections, crumpling the paper. He yelled at me, demanding to know what the hell I was doing, interrupting a closed executive session. He announced to the room that the current system outage was a temporary technical glitch, and he accused me of violating a direct executive order to restore the servers. He threatened to have building security drag me out of the lobby if I did not sit down, shut my mouth, and surrender the administrative passwords immediately. I let him yell. I let his desperate, emotional outburst fill the cold air of the boardroom. The 4 minority shareholders watched him with visible distaste. These were men who valued cold efficiency and quiet authority, and my father was publicly unraveling in front of them. When he finally ran out of breath and stopped shouting, I did not defend myself. I did not engage with his aggressive threats or address his insults. I simply reached into my open briefcase and pulled out 4 thick black binders. I slid one across the smooth walnut table to each of the minority shareholders. I addressed the investors directly, completely ignoring my father. I introduced myself not as the daughter of the founder, but as the chief operating officer and the sole architect of the Aegis software that managed their entire supply chain network. I told them I called this emergency meeting because the chief executive officer was actively concealing a massive financial liability that threatened their entire equity stake in Apex Logistics. Harrison shouted again, calling me a hysterical liar. He aggressively ordered the shareholders not to open the binders, claiming they contained fabricated data created by a disgruntled suspended employee. The oldest shareholder, a man named Vance, looked at my father with cold, unforgiving eyes. He placed his wrinkled hand flat on top of the black binder. He told Harrison to sit down and be quiet. Vance flipped the cover open. The other three men immediately followed his lead. The boardroom fell dead silent again, save for the crisp sound of heavy paper turning. I began my presentation. I kept my voice perfectly level, stripping away any trace of familial emotion. I told them to turn to page 1. I explained that the current server lockout was not a technical glitch, a cyber attack, or a sudden electrical fire. I stated clearly that it was an automated, legally binding security protocol triggered directly by Harrison yesterday morning when he illegally suspended me without cause. I pointed them to the highlighted clause in the licensing agreement, proving the lockout was entirely legitimate. I watched their eyes scan the document. They instantly understood the legal reality. The entire company was paralyzed, and fleets of trucks were stranded outside simply because the CEO broke a fundamental software contract. Harrison sank back into his heavy leather chair. He aggressively wiped sweat from his forehead and tried to formulate a defense, muttering something about corporate insubordination. I cut him off instantly. I told the room the suspension had absolutely nothing to do with insubordination. It was a frantic, desperate attempt to stop me from completing a digital forensic audit before the venture capital team arrived. I instructed the shareholders to turn to Section 2 of the binder. I laid out the exact methodology of the theft. I walked them through the 35 fake vendor invoices. I explained how the vice president of sales deliberately kept every single fraudulent charge exactly under the $48,500 threshold to bypass secondary executive approval. I showed them the routing numbers leading to the Delaware shell companies. I showed them the corporate registries linking those ghost companies directly to Sydney's personal credit card. I did not use the word sister once. I only referred to her by her corporate title, establishing her strictly as a massive corporate liability. A younger shareholder named Miller traced his finger down the column of stolen funds. He asked the question aloud, his voice dripping with absolute disbelief. $1.5 million. He looked up at Harrison and demanded to know how $1.5 million vanished from the operating budget over 14 months without the executive board noticing. Harrison opened his mouth, stammering heavily. He tried to claim he was completely blindsided by the numbers. He said he was investigating the matter privately to protect the company reputation. He swore he was going to force Sydney to repay every single cent once the $10 million venture capital loan cleared this afternoon. He pleaded with the table, trying to spin a massive federal felony into a manageable internal family misunderstanding. I did not let him finish his pathetic lie. I instructed the shareholders to turn to the final section of the binder. This was the kill shot. I directed their attention to the raw database log from the second Tuesday in October. I explained that my software actually caught the suspicious billing activity 2 months ago and automatically froze the outbound payments. I watched the horrifying realization dawn on the faces of the 4 investors. I told them to read the highlighted keystroke log. I stated clearly that the chief executive officer did not initiate a fraud investigation when he was alerted. I proved that Harrison used his unique executive administrative token to manually execute a global override command. I showed them the exact timestamp where he permanently cleared the security flags, whitelisted the fraudulent Delaware accounts, and actively released the stolen funds. I told the board that Harrison had personally aided and abetted federal wire fraud to protect his vice president of sales. The air in the boardroom turned completely toxic. Vance slammed the binder shut. The heavy thud echoed loudly. He glared at my father with a look of pure, unadulterated disgust. He told Harrison he was a criminal and an absolute fool. The other shareholders were practically vibrating with anger. They realized their investments were managed by a man who treated a multi-million-dollar logistics firm like a personal piggy bank to fund a fake lifestyle. Harrison looked completely destroyed. He gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white. He played his final desperate card. He looked at Vance and the others, begging them to stay calm. He yelled that none of this mattered because Andre and Horizon Ventures were finalizing a $10 million capital injection today. He promised the new funding would instantly cover the missing money, reboot the servers, and stabilize the stock value. He told them I was just trying to ruin the deal out of spite, but the massive check was already secured. I reached into my briefcase one last time. I pulled out a single sheet of paper bearing the embossed logo of Horizon Ventures. I held it up for the room to see. I looked directly into my father's panicked, bloodshot eyes. I told him Horizon Ventures was not finalizing anything. I informed the board that Andre had formally withdrawn his entire $10 million offer an hour ago, citing irreconcilable executive fraud. I told Harrison his lifeline was dead, his daughter was facing federal charges, and his company was officially bankrupt. The silence that followed my declaration was absolute. It was the heavy, suffocating quiet of a catastrophic collapse. Harrison stared at the single sheet of paper in my hand as if it were a venomous snake. His mouth opened and closed, but his vocal cords completely failed him. He looked toward the heavy mahogany doors, perhaps expecting Andre to suddenly walk through them and announce it was all a terrible misunderstanding. The doors did open, but Andre was not the one standing in the threshold. Instead, 3 men in immaculate charcoal suits walked purposefully into the boardroom. They moved with a synchronized predatory efficiency that instantly drained whatever remaining oxygen existed in the room. I recognized the man leading the group. It was Marcus Vance, the senior partner at a top-tier corporate litigation firm in Chicago and Andre's personal legal bulldog. He did not carry a briefcase. He carried a thick stack of manila folders securely bound with bright red legal tape. Harrison stumbled backward, his legs hitting the edge of his heavy leather chair. He pointed a trembling finger at the lawyers, demanding to know who authorized them to enter a secure executive floor. Marcus did not acknowledge my father's outrage. He did not even look at him initially. He walked straight to the center of the massive walnut table and placed the stack of folders down with a heavy, definitive thud. Only then did he turn his cold, calculating gaze directly onto Harrison. Marcus spoke in a voice devoid of any human empathy. He formally introduced himself and stated he was acting on the direct, irrevocable instructions of Horizon Ventures. He picked up the first folder, broke the red seal, and handed a dense legal document directly to my father. He announced for the official record that all preliminary funding agreements, term sheets, and letters of intent between Horizon Ventures and Apex Logistics were permanently voided. He cited a material breach of trust and the discovery of active corporate fraud as the primary drivers for the immediate termination. Harrison took the document with violently shaking hands. He stared at the bold legal print, his eyes darting frantically across the page. He tried to speak, attempting to formulate a desperate plea, but Marcus cut him off with surgical precision. The lawyer picked up the second folder and handed it to the oldest minority shareholder at the table. Marcus informed the board that Horizon Ventures had officially frozen all personal and joint assets connected to the vice president of sales. He stated that a formal comprehensive evidence packet regarding the $1.5 million embezzlement had been physically handed to the federal prosecutor downtown exactly 20 minutes ago. The federal authorities were already mobilizing, and a grand jury subpoena was currently being drafted. The boardroom erupted. The 4 minority shareholders abandoned any pretense of professional decorum. The younger shareholder Miller slammed his fist onto the table, shattering a crystal water glass. The sharp crack of breaking glass cut through the shouting. He leaned over the table, his face practically purple with rage, and screamed at Harrison. He demanded to know how a supposedly experienced chief executive let a spoiled daughter turn a profitable, respected logistics network into a massive federal crime scene. Harrison backed away, completely overwhelmed by the vicious verbal assault. He tried to claim he was a victim of a sophisticated cyber attack orchestrated by me. He pointed a shaking finger in my direction, calling me a traitor and a corporate terrorist. He yelled that I manipulated the accounting software to frame his golden child because I was jealous of her success. It was a pathetic, transparent lie, and absolutely no one in the room believed a single word of it. The evidence sitting in their black binders was undeniably authentic. Marcus simply stepped forward, shutting down my father's hysterical accusations with a raised hand. He produced a third document from the final manila folder. He held it up for the entire room to see. It was a formal litigation hold. It legally mandated the immediate absolute preservation of every single server, hard drive, paper ledger, and email server within the entire Apex logistics network. The lawyer looked directly at my father and delivered the final devastating blow. He informed Harrison that any attempt to wipe the servers, destroy physical documents, or alter the digital financial logs would result in immediate arrest for obstruction of justice. He stated that a team of federal forensic accountants would be arriving at the building before noon to physically seize the hardware. Marcus did not wait for a response or answer any questions. He turned on his heel, signaling his legal team, and they walked out of the boardroom in the exact same synchronized manner they entered. The heavy mahogany doors swung shut behind them, sealing my father in his own self-made tomb. The 4 minority shareholders turned their collective fury back onto Harrison. They were practically circling him like sharks smelling blood in the water. The oldest investor demanded Harrison's immediate resignation. He stated they needed to appoint an external crisis management team to deal with the federal authorities and file an emergency bankruptcy petition to shield their remaining personal assets. They were preparing to burn the entire company to the ground today, just to save themselves from the impending legal fallout. I stood quietly at the center of the room, letting the panic run its course. I let them realize that without the Horizon Ventures capital, the company was fundamentally dead. I let them stare deeply into the abyss of a massive federal investigation and a total unrecoverable loss of their equity. When the shouting finally began to die down, replaced by a grim, suffocating despair, I reached into my leather briefcase one final time. I pulled out the crisp, legally binding term sheet Andre had emailed me just hours ago. I placed it flat on the table, right on top of the ruined financial projections my father had been frantically reviewing earlier. I spoke loudly, my voice cutting through the remaining murmurs of panic. I told the board that bankruptcy was an option, but it was an option for cowards and fools. I stated that I did not spend 5 brutal years building a revolutionary logistics software just to watch negligent management drag it into federal court. I looked at the 4 minority shareholders. I told them I had a structural solution. I informed them that Horizon Ventures did not withdraw their capital because the core business was worthless. They withdrew it because the current leadership was corrupt. I tapped the term sheet with my index finger. I announced that Andre was still highly willing to invest. He was offering a $15 million line of credit, ready to be wired into a clean holding company by the end of the business day to absorb the debt and expand operations. But the capital came with one absolute non-negotiable condition. I turned my head and looked directly into my father's defeated, hollow eyes. I told the room the venture capital money was only available if Harrison and Sydney were immediately stripped of all executive titles, their voting shares permanently revoked, and I was installed as the sole chief executive officer of the new corporate entity. The silence returned to the boardroom, but this time it was not the silence of collapse. It was the quiet, calculating silence of ruthless men, realizing they had just been handed a loaded gun, and I was giving them the exact target to shoot. The 4 minority shareholders stared at the crisp, legally binding term sheet I placed on the walnut table. The document represented absolute salvation. It was a golden bridge out of a burning building, but the toll to cross it was the immediate execution of my father's career. The oldest investor, Vance, reached out with a steady hand and pulled the paper toward him. He put on his reading glasses and scanned the clauses. The room was so quiet I could hear the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Harrison remained frozen in his chair, his chest rising and falling in shallow, panicked breaths. He was watching his entire empire slip through his fingers in real time, but his arrogance still refused to let him accept defeat. Harrison slammed his fist on the table, trying to summon a fraction of his former authority. He looked at the four investors and aggressively reminded them of the corporate bylaws. He shouted that I was attempting an illegal coup. He stated that he owned 40% of the voting shares and Sydney owned 10%. He proudly declared that even if I aligned my 10% with the minority shareholders, the combined vote would result in a 50-50 deadlock. He sneered at me, a desperate, ugly expression twisting his exhausted face. He told me a deadlocked vote meant the emergency motion to oust him failed automatically. He claimed he was still the chief executive officer, and he ordered me to pack up my briefcase and leave the building before he called the police for corporate espionage. I did not pack my briefcase. I did not break eye contact with him. I calmly rested my hands on the edge of the mahogany table and leaned forward, claiming the physical space he was desperately trying to hold. I told my father his mathematics were completely correct, but his legal strategy was fundamentally suicidal. I asked him if he honestly believed Andre pulled his $10 million funding and sent his top corporate bulldog just to deliver a polite warning. I explained that when a venture capital firm discovers a company is actively concealing a $1.5 million embezzlement while simultaneously soliciting outside investment, it ceases to be a simple family dispute. It instantly becomes a matter for the Securities and Exchange Commission. I watched the color drain from Harrison's face as the acronym hit the air. I elaborated for the benefit of the boardroom. I stated that the Securities and Exchange Commission does not care about family dynamics or internal nepotism. They care about wire fraud, fraudulent solicitation of capital, and executive cover-ups. I reminded my father that he personally signed off on the clean financial health reports presented to Horizon Ventures just 2 days ago. By doing so while secretly knowing the budget was completely hollowed out, Harrison had elevated Sydney's theft into a massive intentional federal securities crime. Andre was legally obligated to report the discrepancy to protect his own firm from complicity. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a secondary document. It was a drafted, unsigned whistleblower complaint addressed directly to the SEC Enforcement Division, detailing exactly how Harrison manipulated the internal accounting software to deceive external investors. Vance took off his reading glasses and looked at my father with absolute contempt. The elderly investor did not hesitate to align with me. He informed Harrison that if he forced a deadlock and refused to resign immediately, the 4 minority shareholders would co-sign that whistleblower complaint today. Miller, the youngest of the minority investors, leaned aggressively across the table. He pointed a rigid finger directly at Harrison's chest. Miller stated that his investment group would not hesitate to throw Harrison to the federal regulators. He threatened to hire an external auditing firm to thoroughly investigate Harrison's personal tax returns for the last decade, promising to uncover every buried expense and illegal write-off if Harrison dared to hold their equity hostage in a deadlocked vote. Vance made the ultimatum crystal clear. He told Harrison he could either sign his resignation and walk away with a fraction of his dignity, or he could fight the board and spend the rest of his retirement in a federal penitentiary while the government seized his private properties to pay back the defrauded parties. Harrison looked frantically around the room, searching for a single ally. He found none. He looked toward the heavy mahogany doors, perhaps hoping his golden child would miraculously appear to save him. But Sydney was busy dealing with her own impending divorce and federal grand jury subpoena. He was entirely alone. The 50-50 voting deadlock was a useless paper-thin shield against the crushing weight of a coordinated federal investigation. He looked down at his ruined financial projections, his hands trembling violently. The aggressive, bullying patriarch who had controlled our family through fear and intimidation was gone. He was replaced by a terrified, broken old man who finally realized he had run out of lies to tell. I did not offer him a single moment of sympathy. I reached into my folder and slid a pre-drafted resignation letter across the table. Next to it, I placed an irrevocable proxy voting agreement. I told him to sign both documents immediately. I instructed him to formally resign as chief executive officer and legally transfer his 40% voting power directly to me. I stated that if he signed the papers, the new board would handle the debt restructuring quietly, and the SEC whistleblower complaint would never leave my briefcase. I gave him exactly 60 seconds to make his final choice. The silence in the boardroom was absolute. Harrison picked up the heavy silver pen resting next to his water glass. His hands shook so badly he could barely grip the metal barrel. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a toxic mixture of hatred and profound defeat. He whispered that I was destroying the family. I kept my face entirely expressionless. I replied that he destroyed the family the exact moment he chose to protect a thief over the survival of his own company. I tapped my manicured finger next to the signature line. Harrison pressed the pen to the paper. He signed his name on the resignation letter. He flipped to the proxy agreement and signed his name again with a heavy, jagged stroke. The ink was barely dry before Vance snatched the documents away, inspected the signatures, and handed them directly to me. It was official. My father had surrendered his entire legacy. I placed the signed documents into my briefcase and snapped the locks shut. I stood tall at the head of the table. I informed Harrison that he had exactly 15 minutes to clear out his office before building security escorted him off the premises. The era of his toxic leadership was officially dead, and I was now the undisputed architect of Apex Logistics. Harrison did not say another word. He pushed his heavy chair back, the wood scraping harshly against the floor, and walked out of the boardroom, a broken man. Vance and the other shareholders immediately opened their laptops, frantically drafting the emergency board resolutions to legally cement my position before the federal authorities arrived. I did not wait for them to finish. I opened my own laptop right there on the walnut table. I typed in the 12-character master decryption key and hit enter. The digital loading bar flashed green. A few seconds later, I could faintly hear the collective roar of the lobby staff 2 floors below as the servers rebooted and the automated routing algorithms kicked back online. The company was breathing again, and it was entirely under my control. I picked up my briefcase and walked out of the boardroom, heading straight for the corner executive suite. Harrison's brass nameplate was already being unscrewed from the thick oak door by a highly efficient maintenance worker. I stepped inside the massive room and set my bag on the sprawling mahogany desk. Before I could even sit in the leather chair, my phone buzzed aggressively in my pocket. The caller ID displayed my sister's name. I let it ring 3 distinct times before sliding the green icon to accept the call. I did not say hello. I simply held the phone to my ear and listened to the chaotic, breathless sobbing on the other end of the line. Sydney was completely hysterical. She was screaming into the receiver, the background noise echoing loudly as if she were standing in the middle of an empty street. She told me her husband had just served her with expedited divorce papers right in their own driveway. She was hyperventilating so hard she could barely form coherent sentences, but the brutal reality of her situation was perfectly clear. Her husband had somehow intercepted the federal grand jury subpoena delivered to their estate this morning. He instantly realized the pristine luxury lifestyle they were living was secretly funded by a massive corporate embezzlement scheme, an active federal crime that was about to drag his personal financial security straight into a courtroom. He did not hesitate to completely sever ties and protect himself. Sydney shrieked that her husband had legally locked her out of their primary residence, citing the impending federal asset freeze on her personal estate. He had already drained their joint checking accounts and taken possession of both luxury vehicles, legally claiming them as his separate assets to shield them from the government. She was standing alone on the sidewalk with absolutely nothing but the clothes she was wearing and a designer handbag. She desperately begged me to bypass the system and wire emergency cash from the corporate reserve account so she could hire a high-profile defense attorney. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the sprawling downtown skyline. I felt absolutely no pity for the woman who had spent years treating me like disposable trash. I coldly reminded her that the corporate accounts were currently under a strict federal litigation hold monitored by the authorities, and any unauthorized wire transfer would result in my immediate arrest. I told her the stolen money was permanently gone, her marriage was legally terminated, and our father no longer possessed the executive power to shield her from the consequences. I calmly advised her to look up the address for the nearest public defender. Then I hung up the phone and permanently blocked her number. I turned away from the floor-to-ceiling window and walked back to the massive mahogany desk. The heavy leather chair previously occupied by a man who believed he was untouchable was surprisingly comfortable. I sat down and pulled my laptop toward the center of the desk. Securing the Chief Executive Officer title was merely the administrative prerequisite for my actual objective. I had no intention of genuinely saving Apex Logistics. The corporate entity was permanently contaminated by federal wire fraud, gross negligence, and my sister's staggering incompetence. I did not spend 5 years of my life building flawless routing architecture just to attach it to a sinking ship. I opened a secure encrypted communication channel directly to Andre and his legal team at Horizon Ventures. I typed a single decisive confirmation code and hit enter. Instantly, the $15 million line of credit was unlocked, but it was not wired into the Apex Logistics operating accounts. The capital flowed directly into a newly incorporated debt-free holding company I had quietly registered in Delaware 3 weeks ago. I brought up my administrative dashboard and initiated the final sequence of the Aegis protocol. The server reboot I authorized downstairs was not a simple restoration of the old system. It was a highly coordinated mass migration event. I watched the digital progress bars fill rapidly as every single top-tier client contract, every proprietary routing algorithm, and every profitable supply chain network was legally and seamlessly transferred out of the Apex legacy servers. The digital assets were instantly integrated into the clean architecture of the new holding company. I was systematically stripping my father's entire empire for parts in real time, leaving behind absolutely nothing but toxic financial liabilities and an incoming federal audit. The heavy oak door to the executive suite suddenly flew open, slamming violently against the wall. Harrison stood in the doorway clutching a small cardboard box filled with meaningless desk ornaments. His face was completely ashen, drained of whatever residual fury he had possessed. He had just received the automated administrative notification on his phone, the unblockable alert informing all board members of a catastrophic mass transfer of corporate assets. He dropped his cardboard box onto the plush carpet and stared at me in pure, unadulterated horror. He asked me what I had done, his voice breaking into a raspy, defeated whisper. I did not bother to close my laptop. I kept my eyes locked on the successful migration screens and coldly informed him of the brutal reality. I stated that I used the irrevocable proxy voting power he surrendered just 15 minutes ago to unilaterally approve the emergency sale of our entire client roster to a private buyer. I explained that the old Apex Logistics was officially an empty, worthless shell containing a massive federal target on its back. I finally looked up and met his terrified gaze. I told him he was no longer an executive, but he was still legally tethered to the toxic debt of a dead company, and the federal forensic accountants had just walked into the lobby. Harrison collapsed to his knees right there on the plush carpet. He did not yell or threaten me this time. The absolute finality of his destruction had finally shattered his massive ego. I did not stay to watch the federal agents place him in handcuffs. I simply closed my laptop, picked up my briefcase, and walked past his trembling form without a single backward glance. I took the private elevator down to the underground parking garage, bypassing the chaotic scene unfolding in the main lobby. My work at Apex Logistics was permanently finished. 6 months later, the corporate landscape of the logistics industry was entirely unrecognizable. The old Apex entity had spectacularly imploded in a highly publicized federal bankruptcy trial. Sydney had desperately taken a plea deal, trading a reduced sentence in a minimum security facility for her full testimony against our father. Harrison was currently awaiting his own federal sentencing, utterly disgraced and financially ruined by the massive restitution fines levied by the Securities and Exchange Commission. Meanwhile, my new venture, Aegis Global, was thriving beyond all initial projections. The $15 million capital injection from Andre had allowed me to scale operations across 3 new time zones, and the seamless client migration meant we were highly profitable from day one. I was the undisputed leader of a modern, efficient empire, but I had one final piece of personal business to conclude. The federal bankruptcy court had systematically liquidated every single one of my father's personal assets to repay the defrauded investors. The absolute crown jewel of that liquidation was the massive family estate in the suburbs. It was the exact same house where my parents had callously given my bedroom to my sister, just so she could have a second walk-in closet pushing me out like an unwanted tenant. They had always treated me like I did not belong in their perfect home. So I used my personal executive dividends to buy the entire estate in an all-cash anonymous blind auction. I pulled my sleek black town car onto the sweeping circular driveway of the property on a crisp Tuesday morning. The massive front doors were wide open. My mother and Harrison, who was currently out on bail and wearing a cheap electronic ankle monitor, were frantically dragging designer suitcases out onto the front porch. The county sheriff was standing by his cruiser strictly enforcing the 10 o'clock eviction mandate. They froze when I stepped out of the car. My mother looked at me with a desperate, pathetic glimmer of hope, assuming I had come to offer them sanctuary or a massive bailout check. I walked up the stone steps and stopped right in front of them. I did not pull out a checkbook. I pulled the heavy certified property deed from my designer bag and held it up. I watched the horrifying realization wash over their faces as they recognized my name listed as the sole legal owner of their entire sanctuary. My mother started to sob, begging me to let them stay in the guest house, claiming they had absolutely zero money and nowhere else to go. I looked at the two people who had spent my entire life treating me as a disposable stepping stone for their golden child. I felt absolutely nothing but cold, pure satisfaction. I pointed my finger down the long, sweeping driveway toward the heavy iron gates. I told them their time was up and they could go live in the streets. I turned my back on them, walked into my new house, and firmly locked the heavy front door behind me.